discussions actually, that some themes came out. And we were looking at specifically Milton Keynes, the key issues in Milton Keynes. What are the key issues we know about? And what we're seeing on the ground, and significantly, what is not being reported? Because that actually raised a lot of issues. And it was quite clear that there are the obvious areas of deprivation, where there's probably quite a lot of support and structure in, but there's a lot of hidden areas, and they're probably some of the more affluent areas, perhaps on the western flank, where there is a lot of child poverty, but maybe in the families the father's been in work and he's lost his job, and they're actually reluctant to ask for help and ask for benefits and seek benefits. They don't know the system, whereas in other areas the families know how to work the system and they know how to access what they need. And so there's actually a sort of a divide there. So it's not always the obvious areas where the poverty exists. It happens all over the city. Also, we talked about the isolation, and that was partly the isolation of rural areas, the lack of bus services, the lack, again, of access to support, but also, because so many families have moved here, the lack of extended families to provide that support. Although we did say that in some areas there is clearly the grandparents are still key in supporting their families, and whether that is in the practical support such as childcare, whether it's actually the financial support so that the uniform that the child goes to school in is actually been bought by the grandparents, and again that is a hidden aspect of child poverty. We looked at the thresholds of taking children into care, and whether it's actually those young people, young people who are on or slightly above the threshold that actually may in fact lose out, because if they're in care they get the support. If they're just above the thresholds they may lose out on that support, and they honestly they don't really know any difference. And then that led to some discussion on institutionalisation, and perhaps it's those children that will either end up in prison or go into the forces or so on. We looked at the families we know who, there's nobody in the household that's ever been in work, and that has an effect on not only the financial situation, but the lack of teaching life skills and lack of expectations about going into work. And maybe when the young person leaves education, they're not encouraged to go on into into further education or training, and if they haven't got a job and they're not in education, they might get kicked out because they're a financial burden on their family. And general lack of self-esteem and lack of self-confidence. But I think one of the key points that came through in all the groups was that there are actually higher hidden areas. It's all across the city. It's not just the obvious areas where we're seeing the child poverty.
Was that it's about building trust and relationships in terms of identifying child poverty, about children being able to come up and say, I'm really hungry. That's about building trust and relationships. And everything else that is successful, such as effective signposting and empowering the individuals to make a change, that's about building a relationship with them. And strategies won't work if there's not trust. Also, all good practice examples that we had on the table involved an agency or an individual or a role model gaining the trust of the family or the child, and then making a positive difference.
First two groups I had, we actually felt that people were in denial in terms of their poverty, especially those who may have fallen from the career ladder. They don't really know what services to access and may not want to access them because of self-esteem and so forth. So sometimes I think we're probably forgetting those people. We felt that there was a lot of hidden deprivation in the city, and that needs to be addressed. And how can that be addressed? We need to listen to people. We need to ask the right questions. We need to respond accordingly and build relationships and get people involved. And we thought one of the ways would be to get schools involved, because when you're getting schools involved, there are quite a few telltale signs with children as well. If their clothes are getting smaller or tighter or something, or certain things that the teachers can pick up on before the kids start getting bullied in school or in the playground. And the other thing we felt, the other thing that actually came out was more work with agencies working together yeah, rather than people working by themselves. A lot of people are doing the same thing, but there's a lot of duplication in services. But if we kind of brought all our efforts together, we could work wonders. And the other thing was introduce mobile advisory services that visit rural areas. Sometimes in all this agenda we forget the rural areas, that there are people in the rural areas that actually need services. So maybe having a mobile bus, an advisory bus that goes and visits, like I think we used to have mobile library services that used to visit the rural areas. So maybe some of these services can visit there. So, and also don't put services on that are not needed by the community. Ask them what it is they want. And another thing where we thought taking things forward would be having brand names. Like if you have a problem, contact, like the CAB is like a brand name, the AA is a brand name. So, you know, as soon as there is a problem, it automatically clicks, well, oh no, that's the agency we need to contact. So agencies working together and putting all their efforts to kind of creating those kind of brand names which people can kind of remember. The other thing we said was that some of the helplines are very, very expensive. There are 0845 numbers or 0844 numbers, and before you know it, your credit's gone from your credit card or whatever method of payment you are using. And also the most important thing that came out was giving people choices, empowering them to make that different. All part of David Cameron's big society agenda, you could say.
A lot of the focus was around the point of working in partnership with other agencies, and we said many groups felt that, and organisations felt that within their sector, within their section of their sector, they felt that they'd found their partners who they worked really strongly with. They knew who they could rely on, they knew who they could turn to, and they knew, most importantly, they could signpost their families and the children that they'd worked with too. However, they felt that probably across the city we need to get better at that and building the wider connections. There was, and having events like today, there was at least one occasion where I was able to pass a piece of information to somebody that I hadn't had the opportunity to do so already. It wasn't because I was hiding it, but because, you know, you're in your piece of work and it's sometimes difficult to pass that on. So the strength of having networks like this and being open to what other people are doing is very, very important. Well, the other points was the sort of thing around localism. There's so much resource and an opportunity for resources locally. Local hubs where people gather. We felt that that was the real strong points, where the real chance where we can support children and families to better their lives, to be more connected to place and those facilities in those areas. We talked about resource centres run out of shops. We talked about how children's centres could be better used and broader use of those facilities to meet the needs of children and families.
Theme number 1, housing. We need more affordable housing. We need to put pressure on private landlords to increase standards, and 1 or 2 housing associations which are substandard, so a bit of lobbying to go on there. We spoke about community assets that are going to be transferred to the community if they want them by 2014, so do we want them and the expense of continuing to run them. So that's stuff around housing. Another theme would be relationships, and I didn't even bring it up. It was about parenting classes, because no one gets training. We're not born with the ability to be a parent. The breakdown in relationships around partners, adjusting to step families, domestic violence being a really important issue, especially kids having to live in a household, witnessing it all the times, and the knock-on effects from that, and how it gets passed through the generations. Kids are growing up too quickly these days. We need to learn to manage relationships better, and the stuff around emotional intelligence and resilience. Theme number 2. Theme number 3 about money. We need to big up credit unions. We need to get rid of loan sharks. We need to campaign for a living wage. That's £7.20 an hour. We need to create more opportunities for people to earn money. We need to encourage cooperatives and mutuals and people getting together. Theme number 4, information, advice and guidance. There's this fascinating idea of lots of things could potentially kick in when we hear the words, "you're pregnant." And then someone else said, no, it needs to happen much earlier than that. And then someone else said, no, it needs to happen a bit later than that, when kids realise they're the poor one, so probably 5 or 6. So we need to think about when stuff starts happening for people. First thing we need to do is ask people themselves living in poverty what they want. Often forget that. We need to get better at saying what support is available. We need to encourage role models and case studies to show how people got themselves out of difficult situations, and that would enthuse people and help agencies replicate those ideas. We need to make people think that they are employable and it is worth going back to school and it is worth getting stuck into a local community group or building up their CV or whatever. Another theme would be practical help. So we started talking about the food bank, baby basics, which is recycled clothes for kids. We invented school uniform bank, which schools are going to start running. So that's recycled school uniforms, practical. We want some, probably impractical to say all, but a lot of services locally based, so people don't have the transport costs and it's easy to get to. Blah, blah, blah. We want to use CAF more effectively. There's something there about using the existing systems more effectively if we still want them. In terms of venues where things can happen, we spoke about schools, Sure Start centres, The Point, people doing things for themselves. So the example given was parents setting up their own nurseries to run creches and stuff for themselves, which would be cheap. But one of the barriers to that is all the legislation, so we need to tackle that. Transport, so we've got 104 miles of redway in Milton Keynes. Cycling is really good for you and it's good for the environment. Thinking about transport and how to improve it will get better access to services and better chance of employment. And then finally, we all need to change our mindsets maybe. So, you know, we're not going to do everything for everyone anymore. We need to encourage people to get stuck in and do things for themselves. We need to improve people's emotional intelligence and emotional resilience. And we need to learn from different cultures' experiences of how they do it.
What everybody said is that they were really impressed with the young people, how they were able to articulate on their issues, their problems, and why it was important to hear their voices and to be heard. And normally, everybody recognises it's usually the adult that's making the decisions and discussing what the child's needs are, and very little consultation with the young person. So, although it was very well put together and everybody was clearly moved by the documentary, it was very well made, it was quite provocative because we felt that it had a slight lean in. What it didn't do, which goes on to another point, was actually highlight diversity of need, cultural needs, people that are subject to immigration control, have no recourse to public funds, that are living in dire poverty, did have no access to means-tested benefits. There was no emphasis on that at all. Disabilities, mental health, there were lots of other issues, young carers, but again, were living in very difficult situations. So it wasn't very balanced in that point. And we felt there should have been a counter-argument, almost a follow-up documentary, because it portrayed the difficulties of the young people very well, but what it didn't do is address or identify all the wraparound services that we know that do exist in Milton Keynes. Even though we may need to align those services better and identify and map what services exist, there are a lot of resources in Milton Keynes, and that's what we were comparing it with. What existed in those areas, in those local authority areas? Who was doing what? Who was planning the redevelopment of those areas? We saw flats being demolished. What was the vision for those areas? What were the strategies? What were those other Sure Start centres doing? Outreach play facilities. So there were lots of resources that it didn't cover. It didn't address any of that. What were the political aspects? What concentrated on those areas? And so we felt there should have been a follow-up documentary just to answer what were the intentions, what was the vision, where was their child poverty strategy, and how were they going to address all those issues. And it would have been quite interesting to have heard all of that as well.